Thank you. So let me set the scene. It's January 2022. It's lightly snowing. I have a 5-hour drive ahead of me, full tank of gas in my SUV, hot latte in the cup holder, and no kids in the back seat begging for the Hamilton soundtrack. So for a mom of 3 like me, this is basically a weekend away. So I press play on my favorite podcast, and it's researchers who are talking about, they're economists and they are business school professors, and they've just published a study talking about the 24 million Americans who have left the workplace between April and August of 2021. The Great Resignation, as organizational psychologist Anthony Klontz has coined it. So with over 1 million people who have died in this country from COVID-19 and 9 million people grieving, I assume that this podcast is going to talk about something that is dear to my heart, grief and loss. How could it not? You see where this is going. 1 hour and 6 minutes later, the podcast has not said the words grief, loss, or death, even one time. Businesses are struggling to get back to work. And in the concept of getting back to work, they mean bringing people back to the office. In the year since that podcast, there's been another phrase you may have heard, quiet quitting. The same employees who were heralded as saving the day in the early days of the pandemic are now suddenly lazy, disinterested, and unwilling to work. Does that even make sense to you? People have been fundamentally changed by these last couple of years. They took their personal relationships and they put them on computer screens. They lost teams and mentors and office spaces, and they didn't even really get a chance to say goodbye. Not to mention the fact that many of those people also suffered bereavements. They had people who died, who they loved during that time. For the past 20 years, I've worked as a trauma-informed therapist specializing in grief and loss. So I've had more conversations about grief than the average bear. But when my own mother died suddenly 3 years ago, my life turned completely upside down. Within 3 weeks of her death, I was hardly sleeping, barely eating. I had problems with my memory. I couldn't recall words. I was super irritable, not fun to be around, and very anxious and self-conscious around other people. Now, as a clinician, what I knew was to expect those symptoms to lessen. That's what typically happens. What actually happened for me was my symptoms got much worse. So I knew that I needed treatment and intervention. It is really important for us to be able to know when to seek help, what that help looks like, and how to access it. You know, we spend 1/3 of our lives at work, 1/3 of our lives, and we invest next to nothing talking about a subject that 100% of us here will ultimately experience, which is grief and loss, right? So why do we do that? Why do we not invest anything in grief and loss? Well, it's awkward to talk about. You know what? It's awkward for clinicians also. But there's a lot in the workplace, right? There's discrimination, sexual harassment, bullying, all sorts of topics that are awkward to talk about that we have mandatory gotta be there meetings on Mondays. So how could companies begin to help us talk about that? Let me give you an example of one of my clients, Alice. Alice worked for her company for 20 years. She loved her company. She had a great relationship with the CEO. And when her mother died suddenly during COVID, the CEO sent flowers, gift cards, called, and said, take all the time that you need. Alice also worked for HR, So she knew what the actual bereavement policy was. So she made sure she was back at her desk 3 days after her mother's funeral, which was on Zoom. When she opened her computer, she was stunned to discover that she had 1,000 emails waiting for her and had already missed 2 significant deadlines. So one of the symptoms of early grief is brain fog. She could barely read these emails, never mind attend to them. And when word kind of got around to her CEO that she was a little overwhelmed, he poked her head in, asked if she needed more help, which she took as criticism. So when she came to her weekly therapy appointments, she was suddenly saying things like, well, you know, he only really cares about the bottom line. So 6 months after her mother's death, Alice quit this job that she had loved for years and years. And when she did, her CEO told her he felt personally betrayed after everything that his company had done for Alice, which he truly believed was the case. When Alice sat with HR to give an exit interview, which was pretty much the first real conversation anyone had had with her about how she was doing, she said, my workload balance, and I don't feel respected in this company. Now, had that podcast team collated Alice's data, collected that, what they would have said was, well, she's working in a toxic workplace environment. But we know she wasn't. She loved her job. They loved her back. What she was doing was working in an environment that was not grief-informed. They didn't know better. They didn't know better. So how could grief education have helped everyone in this story? Well, as a grief-informed expert, I can tell you, here's just one quick example of what we teach people just in a regular training with leadership and employees. We talk about the amygdala, which is this tiny little thing at the base of your brain, and it enlarges during threat. So that's good. It enlarges and it activates your fight, flight, and freeze responses. It keeps us alive. The little side effect of the amygdala enlarging is that there's other messages that are trying to get from the base of the brain to your prefrontal cortex. This is like a really long distance in the brain. It's trying to get up here where you can do your critical thinking. So this is predictable. Alice's brain fog is 100% predictable. And grief experts have these techniques that are so simple. Alice could have done them at her desk had they been informed, had they been asked. So what can companies do to indicate they understand the significance of the grief that has been so present over the past 2 years? Okay, the first thing we all have to do is take a breath and understand that nobody took a class in business school on managing through a global pandemic. We are all doing the best we can. The pointing fingers is not helping. But also leadership does need to kind of get up to speed as fast as they can. So identifying grief experts, bring them into the highest level of conversation, help them help you. Number 2, have a grief-related mission statement that it's written down. People can look at it. This is how our company wants you to feel as you are grieving. These are the things we are going to be doing practically. If that's not happening, let's have a conversation. And number 3, let's monitor our employees. Don't wait till their exit interview to ask them how they're doing. Don't assume that they're doing their grief and loss in their therapist's office for just 1 hour a week. Ask them, how are they doing? Doing this is a way of exhibiting to your employees that you respect them. And that respect translates into growth. It translates into commitment. It translates into employee retention, even during these really challenging times, right? So I really hope you will leave here today looking up the numbers for your HR department. Go talk to them and find out, what do they already do with grief? What are your bereavement policies? How do you feel about them? Find out what resources are available, and I'm gonna guess that it's probably not enough. Ask them if they would consider bringing grief-informed training into the office so that we can create a grief-informed community in the office. So here's how that might have looked for Alice Imagine if Alice is going back to work and she knows her team's been grief informed. So they are already prepared for her to be a little bit disorganized in her thinking and probably exhausted long before 5 o'clock rolls around. So she's not expecting to be up to speed. She knows they don't expect to be up to speed. She's going to sit down with her employees and her leadership. They're going to co-create a plan. And in that plan, it's going to include the possibility that Alice's grief symptoms are going to exist for a while, and she's going to let us know when she's ready to take on a little bit more. That conversation, that flexibility is really critical. So as you are asking your HR departments to bring in that commitment around grief and loss, understand that you are inside your business organization. You are also allowing us all as a culture to shift the conversation around grief and loss and for us all to become better grief informed. Thank you so much.